Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So I was looking at some of my old videos, and at the end of 2023 I did this video of me drawing random expressions for my OCs in kind of like a chibi format based on a expression meme template. So I wanted to do the same thing today, but we are going to be starting in Procreate to do the sketching portion, so let's go ahead and get there first. So here is my OC folder in Procreate, and I was just going to scroll back to look for my old version to kind of see how I formatted everything. So I did a kind of 4x5, which is 20 expressions onto one little canvas with this grid patterning. And this was the previous session right here and the template on the right hand side. So let's go ahead and make a new canvas, and I will expand the template so that we can fit 24 expressions this time, as I have a different kind of sheet that I'm going to be using. So I have a wheel, and somehow I accidentally turned off one of the settings that I wanted to use, but I'm going to only include 6 of my OCs today, which includes Masaki, Koji, Sato, Akemi, Kaisen, and Moriko. So I'm only including the 6 because the other 2, which are Akemi siblings, I'm still a little bit hesitant on finalizing their design, so until they're fully finished, I will include them in another batch in the future. So let's go ahead, open up a reference little tab and import our template, or our meme template that I'm going to be referring to. And I'm going to do these in my own style and kind of altering them slightly depending on, I guess, like how I feel about them. So either tailoring it more towards the character or adjusting it just to fit my style a little bit more closer, if that makes sense. So spinning that wheel, we are going to start off with my OC Masaki, which feels very appropriate because he is like my first OC after abandoning like a whole batch of my previous ones from my middle school, high school days. So for the template, or like the image done referencing, so it is a kind of 4x6 grid, and for me, because I do have 6 OCs, and I forgot to do this for the previous batch, is that I will eliminate the OC's name from the wheel one by one so that we don't have any overlap, and then we can have an equal distribution of each OC gets 4 different expressions each for this particular template. Unfortunately, last time I didn't realize that it was like easily divisible by 4, so Sato got the least amount of expressions, and I think Masaki gained like an extra one, so he had 5 and Sato had 4. So yeah, I'm making sure that all of them will have an equal amount for the most part. I also decided to copy over one of my old chibis from the previous template over so that we can kind of keep a similar size for all of them. Obviously, as I'm going to be doing like the line work and transferring my drawings, some of them do become a little bit bigger, and some of them feel a little bit different and inconsistent compared to the previous batch, but we'll talk about that because it'll happen mostly during the line art phase. So for the sketching, I do prefer kind of doing like any kind of faster drawing, looser drawings, doodling, sketching, all of that on Procreate. I just find it a little bit more easier for myself and more natural feeling to like traditional art, so I find myself sketching a little bit faster, which is why I decided to work in Procreate. But later on we will switch over to Clip Studio Paint and onto my other tablet so that we can do line work, as I don't like doing line work all that much in Procreate. So for the most part, just the sketch round brush in Procreate first, and we'll just go one by one, keep spinning the wheel. And I'm only gonna do a few real-time clips here and there, or like snippets, so that we can actually get through all of the rest of the footage. So most of it will be kind of time-lapse footage here and there, and hopefully it won't become too hard to watch, as the footage might get super fast, so my hand might be whipping around a little bit quickly. I do think it's going to be a little bit easier to watch once we switch over to the other tablet, as I kind of zoom in and out and rotate just a little bit less than I do on the iPad. But for the most part, I had a lot of fun, and I think a lot of the OCs had kind of expressions that are a little bit out of character for them. More so for, I don't know, I think Masaki, the initial one, was definitely not more like in his character. And I think Moriko had one, and I think Kaisen had maybe a few. But overall, I don't know if it's because they're like in a chibi form and they're very colorful and look very cute together. I didn't mind them being out of character because I wanted to make sure I did these randomized because I didn't want to have to pick and choose and be like, oh, I think this suits so-and-so more than this character and all that. It's just easier for me to just have to deal with the expression for the specific character. With that being said, I did struggle because some of them were so out of character that it just didn't feel right to draw them as such. But some of them had some very funny looking expressions. And I think it's because the template has some very exaggerated ones, which typically I wouldn't draw those particular expressions like on my own without some kind of prompt. So it's kind of fun to do these every so often. And I do have a few other ones saved. I'll make sure if I can find the original for these expression templates and stuff, I'll make sure to leave them into the description so you guys can have access to them if you like to draw your own versions as well, or just like reference the template like I'm doing right here. I think compared to the previous session, I don't know if it's because I was getting a little bit tired of just drawing chibi after chibi after chibi over and over and over again. I did lose steam at some point, and some of the proportioning or the spacing for the characters, like facial expressions, maybe their eye spacing, their hair, their body or something. Sometimes I either misalign stuff or the spacing just looks off, some things are too small, and then later on I'm going to have so many inconsistencies that hopefully it won't really affect the end result too much. I think on their own all of them are probably perfectly fine, but as a set I don't know, there's just too many inconsistencies that I kind of wished I took a little bit more care and slowed down a little bit. But here we are with the final little sketches for all 24 of the chibi expressions for my OCs. So I think for the most part, yeah, everyone has 4 each for 6. So we have 4 by 6, which is 24, which means that we have an even distribution, which is great. And I'm going to probably struggle once we have 8 OCs on the board next time. So before we swing on to Clip Studio Paint, I wanted to show you guys the quick time-lapse version, just in case if you do not want to watch through the weird footage of the time-lapse of me sketching all the chibis out. This might be a little bit easier on the eyes, so I'll come back when we're back to Clip Studio Paint. So now on to Clip Studio Paint. Here's actually the little finished version of my previous session, which like I mentioned, you can watch this video right here if you're interested in seeing the process for this and how I chose the different expressions for that one. But I wanted to show you guys what kind of generally the look I'm going for. It's much more of a cleaner-ish style with somewhat consistent line work throughout the entire thing, has a thicker outline on the outside of everything, which we'll do at the very end, but working on these sketches. So I did import them into Clip Studio Paint with the grid and everything. So let's go ahead and pop this one out so we can use it as kind of like our reference so I can see the line work as well as the colors for later. But for now, we can lower down the opacity and kind of prepare our layers. Now it's going to be a little bit hard to see at first, but I will be splitting my line art into 4 different sections, but we'll be mostly focusing on 2 different layers. So right now I decided to copy and paste the previous session so that we can figure out what kind of size I was using. I luckily recorded and I could see what brush I'm using for the line art, so I will link that into the description if you're interested. I just like this brush just because it's a little bit more on the consistent size in terms of line width. So typically, if I'm doing any kind of line work, I will kind of like fuss around and try to find what I think would work the best for the particular drawing session. But if I don't really care and I'm just doing like a normal illustration, I will use the G pen with some kind of stabilization alongside with another setting that allows me to work slow and then work quick if I do like quick flicks of the pen so that the stabilization becomes a lot lower. But for these ones, I think my stabilization's probably at 60 on Clip Studio Paint, which is fairly high, but I do like having enough control to make sure that my lines are not too wobbly and that I'm putting a somewhat consistent pressure so that the line width does not kind of vary too much. But like I mentioned, this brush itself already has more of a consistent line weight anyways, but if you do flick a little bit, it does kind of taper ever so slightly. So I want to make sure that if I want to keep everything clean and kind of very, I don't know how to explain it, it just looks a little bit better if I don't leave too many areas with tapered lines if I want them to kind of conjoin and meet together. So it just makes everything look a little bit more clean and easier to read, in my opinion. So we are moving back into time-lapse mode. So I did not want to keep the grid into the actual final product of the drawings for today. Similar to the previous session, I added a kind of line to the bottom so that they're kind of like their own standalone. And I didn't want them to be contained in a box because later on I'm going to painstakingly kind of crop each individual little chibi out of the canvas so that I can save them as their own individual image. So later on, if I want to use a particular emote or emoji or whatever you want to call these little chibi expressions, then I can use them separately without having to like copy and paste from the final image, if that makes sense. So in the end, I will end up with about, I think it's 44 different chibis. And definitely when I finish Akemi's siblings and maybe Salwin and or another OC. I'm not too sure. I don't know if it's because I keep browsing other people's OCs. I'm like, oh, I want an OC with this hair color and this kind of hairstyle or like this particular aesthetic. I'm not the type to usually gravitate towards like designing OCs because I do feel bad if I don't draw like particular OCs as much or like end up abandoning them like I did with my previous OCs like from my middle school and high school days. So we'll see what happens, but I definitely think it's kind of fun to always revisit and come back and do something to add them to our little ensemble family, I guess. That makes sense. So it's nice to add Kaisen and Moriko kind of to our batch, even though they probably have the least amount of expressions. But it's just nice to add them and have something I can consistently keep making artwork for that I will probably use in the future, maybe. If not, I'll make them into like personalized stickers or something. So I'm not too sure which view people prefer. I think the majority of people prefer seeing my hand on the tablet, making the like brush strokes and like actually working on the tablet so you can kind of see where my hand or the brush is. But I definitely think for time lapses, sometimes this is a little bit easier to watch because there's not my hand in the way. You can kind of get the full image of the kind of illustration coming together. So yeah, I decided to include some of the footage like this with the screen recording method so that you can kind of see the entirety of everything alongside with the fact that you kind of see where I go back and forth of redoing lines over and over again. So now with our line art done, you can actually see my layers on the left hand side, and there's 3 colored layers and then one other kind of dark gray underneath my red layer, which is kind of the 4 different line art layers that I ended up with. So the yellow one has all of my effects. So that'll be like all the little puffs of air, the little stars or sparkles, like the little sweat marks and all that stuff. The blue layer has all of their eyes on a separate layer so that I can color them individually without having to avoid every other line art. The red has everything else, so that includes their face, their hands, their hair, their outfit. And then the layer below that is strictly for the Akemi one that looks like he's plotting, just because I want to make sure the text is behind his chibi instead of like conjoined with everything else. So with that all being done, let's go ahead and pop the blue and the red one into a folder. I'm going to hit Control and select the lines. Then I'm going to expand the selection by I think 3 at this time, but later on I will change it to 5 pixels so that we kind of have a thicker outline overall. So the way how I thicken the outline is on a separate layer. So I'm going to drop that to the very bottom and I'm going to start filling in kind of a base color on the inside. In this case, I'm using gray, and there's this Very nice tool that you can use. I'll link it in the description if you're interested, but it's kind of like a selection tool that automatically fills, and you can play around with the settings to make sure that it fills correctly to your needs. But I find this really easy for me to do colors all at once. If you don't want to use the brush, you can definitely select the outside of your line art, invert it, and then fill. It'll pretty much give you the same effect. But there are some areas that it does fill in that I don't need to be filled in, so I'm going to go ahead and erase some of these and use the other brush to kind of erase all of the areas that I don't want the gray to be. After that, I will make a folder and clip that folder to this dark gray layer base, so any color that I want to add on will stay within our dark gray. So I'm starting off with skin tone. So I started with Masaki Sato, Akemi, and Kaisen, which have roughly similar skin tone on the more fairer side. Koji's on the tanner side, and we have Moriko with a different skin tone as well. So I kind of did it in that order. After that, I started to fill in their hair alongside with their outfits. So for the layers here, I decided to do all their skin on one layer, and we'll add an extra layer to do the shadows, the blush, and any of those. Then for the rest of the colors, I put them all in one layer, which you'll see later why I do this, and it's kind of the easiest way for me to add any shading or highlights to all the chibis at once. So right now, I'm just kind of focused on putting the colors in the correct place. Later on, I will probably cut it out of the video that I will go back in and painstakingly try to fix all the colors and make sure I didn't miss any areas, which inevitably I tend to miss some areas like corners and stuff just because I just don't see them. I decided to change the background just to make sure I didn't have any missing pixels anywhere that I need to refill. So right now I am working on their eye colors. So I went ahead and referenced the previous batch and did Masaki, Koji, Sato, and Akemi first. And I accidentally added Akemi's eye color to Koji, and for some reason I did not notice until I started to work on Akemi. So for now, Koji will have kind of like goldish, amberish colored eyes until we get to Akemi and I start to fix it. I did have to adjust Moriko's eye color a little bit later because they just appeared a little bit too light, but her eye color is a very light pale green. I just wasn't sure how I wanted to approach her eye color to make sure that they stand out properly. So later on, I will change the base color to be a little bit darker. Then we have the correction for Koji's eyes. I did the rest of the other eyes alongside with any other corrections that I needed to make. So we are back to this particular view, and I went ahead and made a new layer to clip over our skin tone layer, and I am filling in all of our shadows. So for the most part, how I'm approaching all of these chibis, and probably how I'm going to approach these chibis in the future, is that I'm going to like 90% make them cell shaded, which means that they kind of have more of a clean, clear-cut kind of shading method that's very crisp and very sharp. But I am going to add a little bit of blush here and there and use a slightly softer brush to do the little blush lines to the chibis just to add a touch of softness. And we'll soften everything slightly a little bit later. But for the most part, I want these to still look quite bold. And at this kind of scale and how I want them to be able to read if they become a little bit smaller is that I want them to read very clear. So there's not really a need for me to go and shade everything with more of a soft painterly method, if that makes sense, because a lot of those details would get lost and it just feels like a little bit of a waste of time and only would benefit me if I'm looking at the chibis up close. I don't really know where I'm gonna add these chibis to. I've occasionally used them for different YouTube shorts here and there, but I don't make shorts like consistently enough for me to constantly use them. So I'll definitely think of making a sticker pack or something of my OCs if I open my store. And I still want to juggle the idea of maybe making a sticker club of some sort and just doing a whole batch of chibis like that every month that I could potentially do like, I don't know, it feels like pen pal mail, if that makes sense. I would love to do that eventually if I can find the time. And I would like to do one for OCs and potentially some other like fan art or fandoms as well. So we'll see if I can get to that, and I'll try to figure out all the like logistics and the proper like postage and stamps and stuff, because I want to keep these as like normal letter mail rather than like actual physical packages. So yeah, if I ever do that, I'll let you guys know, and you guys can join in with the kind of little sticker fun as well if you would like to. So for the skin, I did do the majority, so I guess like Masaki, Sato, Akemi, and Kaisen first. I did do their blush alongside with the little blush lines. Then I went ahead and did Koji. Now, I don't remember if I did this in the previous video, is that I went to use a multiply layer to do his little freckles. I believe I just copied a similar color and just did it on the same layer, just because I don't think it makes too much of a difference here. And like I said, on a much smaller scale, there's not really a need for me to alter or change the freckles to have a little bit more hue variety or value variety there. Also, Akemi needs a little bit of shadow or shading, so I added 2 multiply layers to give him that little sinister-ish look for the most part. Then after that, we start to work on Moriko. So Moriko was a little bit difficult in terms of color, just because I believe it might be my tablet monitor versus like the glare in this particular room was just making it very hard for me to see if I was making her shadow color too saturated, like too pinkish red, or was it looking a little bit too dull. So hopefully it turned out okay, and I didn't have to really fight with the sun to kind of see my screen at this point. Okay, so this is kind of the part where I do the majority of the shading. So skin had very like particular colors that I wanted to use for them, so I didn't want to use a multiply layer. But for the previous batch, I used a kind of faded mid-tone-ish purple, kind of closer to the gray side, if anything, to do the shadows for everything. So that's including the hair and their outfits. So for the hair, I kept it quite simple by doing a kind of a swooping band in a one direction that fills the bottom half of their hair. I think Sato is the only exception, as she has like her hair tied, so I will color it slightly separately to give it a little bit more depth. Oh, I also forgot Akemi's stripes, so I'm quickly filling those in. But as I'm doing the rest of their hair, I am mostly not going to really follow the form of their hair too much, just because I want to keep these as simple as possible. But we'll kind of play around with the colors a little bit later to make it appear softer, and just add that last little touch to make it look a tiny bit more finished compared to if I just left them as black lines. But after this, I will be adding highlights kind of in a similar manner. So unfortunately, you can't really see the little Moriko in somewhat the bottom left-hand corner that's like doing the peace sign that's kind of cut off. So I added 2 little circles onto that canvas very briefly because I wanted to make sure I'm referring to the same colors. So one was the purple that I used in the previous session, which I'm doing for all of their shadows. And then I have kind of a mid-tone yellow gold color that I'm using for all of their highlights as well. So instead of putting this on to add, which is usually one of my favorite layers to do if I'm doing any kind of like rim lighting or just additive light in general, but this time I decided to use the screen, which is what I did with the previous session. So I wanted to use screen because it kind of feels like the opposite of multiply. It makes things a lot lighter. It still retains that kind of like yellowish color, but it just fits nicely on all of the colors at once, so I don't really have to worry about adjusting the colors too much to fit each individual character. It just gives them a nice little consistency throughout. So to tie everything together, I am taking the shadow color from each individual character. So in this case, Masaki kind of has this reddish brown color, and I'm filling the inside lines of their hair. I'm also going to be filling the kind of inside portions of certain parts of the skin where I wanted to make sure that they are red so that they don't appear too in your face, I guess. So this would include like their hands, their mouths mostly, so like their fingers, I guess, and their mouths. Then after that, I went back and started to fill in the rest of the line work. So Moriko and Kaisen, I think, have the same hair color at this point, so they shared kind of a similar dark gray. Akemi kind of has this almost purpley blue compared to his hair color, and I'm just filling in these lines. It kind of gives this nice little quality, and I kind of like it because any part that's like underneath where the shadow is kind of has the dark outline, and then anywhere else has the light outline, so it just gives it a little bit of softness and slight amount of depth in a very simple way. After that, I changed the line art to any other portion, and I think that's it for the little chibi session for today. I know this video is a little bit long, and I'm sorry that I didn't show footage for every individual chibi on their own, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of what the little process I do, and you can kind of see the different inconsistencies that I have for the chibis. I think the first Masaki had too thick of an outline, then I went too thin of an outline. Some of them have more consistent outlines towards the kind of like the end. I think the last 3 rows have the most consistency compared to all of them. Also, this Kaisen. So he's on the thumbnail because he's also my favorite, but the Sato one is also my favorite. So yeah, it's just some of them I like a lot. Oh, and yeah, these 2 of Moriko I really like as well. I just think she looks super cute. I want to draw her more definitely. So hopefully I will do some more OC illustrations in the future. And hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!